Kelvin Oxford sat in his sleek corner office, overlooking the bustling streets of New York City. His hands rested lightly on the desk, but his mind was miles away. The day-to-day operations of his empire seemed effortless, yet the whispers were beginning to creep in. Whispers about Ben White, the manager of his flagship Seyfel store, and the way he had been treating some of the staff and customers. Kelvin had built his empire on the principles of inclusivity, valuing both his customers and employees equally, regardless of their race or background. But now, he was hearing rumors of racial biases creeping into his business, especially within the walls of his beloved store. The thought made Darius's blood boil. He'd worked too hard, too long, to allow something like this to stain his brand. He knew he had to investigate firsthand, but how? He wouldn't be able to get the truth if he went in as himself. He decided to do something radical, go undercover. He would show up as just another customer, not as the man whose name was emblazoned on the building. It was time to expose the rot, if it existed, in the most brutal and direct way possible. As Kelvin prepared for the undercover mission, his thoughts drifted back to his roots. He had not always been the powerful businessman he was today. Growing up in Sunderland, in a neighborhood that had taught him resilience, he learned early on that the world was not kind to those who looked like him. As a young black man, Kelvin faced constant discrimination. He remembered the subtle and not so subtle ways people treated him when he first entered the luxury fashion industry. The stares, the questions, the dismissive gestures, he was all too familiar with them. But instead of being crushed, he used those experiences as fuel. He built a brand that celebrated diversity and inclusivity, positioning himself as a beacon of hope for people who felt overlooked and underappreciated. The store he built was a symbol that black excellence could thrive in spaces that had long been closed off to people of color. But here, in his flagship store, it seemed that the very people who represented the core of his brand were losing sight of that mission. Kelvin was determined to find out why and what had happened to the company he fought so hard to build. The night before his undercover visit, Kelvin spent hours in front of the mirror, deciding what to wear. He knew that if he was going to blend in, he couldn't walk in wearing his usual designer suits and polished shoes. No, today he would be someone else. He grabbed a plain hoodie, a pair of jeans, and sneakers, clothes that made him look like just another customer off the street. He studied his reflection, trying to forget the man he had become, the mogul who moved in the circles of the wealthy and powerful. Beneath the surface, though, he could feel the tightness in his chest. He had never liked pretending to be someone he wasn't, but he understood the necessity of it now. He could not risk any suspicion. Kelvin took a deep breath and walked out of his apartment. He needed to experience the store as an everyday customer, just as others might. This would be his chance to see if the rumors were true or if his business had become something it was never meant to be. As Kelvin walked into the Seyfel store, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. The sleek glass doors slid open with a soft swoosh, and the familiar scent of expensive perfume and leather filled his nostrils. But instead of the warm welcome he expected, there was an icy coldness that seemed to permeate the space. Staff members were scattered around, but no one acknowledged his presence. The usual cheerful greetings were absent. Kelvin wandered the aisles, casually inspecting the merchandise, but no one approached him. His feet carried him further into the store, but the discomfort he felt grew with each step. He could sense the judgment in the air, though no one said a word. It was as if they had written him off the moment they saw his casual clothes. He picked up a few items, pretending to be interested in them, but no one came to assist. It was only when he made his way to the high-end section where the most expensive pieces were displayed that he saw the disdain in the eyes of a staff member. The person didn't even try to hide their expression of superiority, as though they could tell Kelvin wasn't one of them. Kelvin's suspicions were confirmed when Ben White, the store manager, approached. Ben's gaze swept over Kelvin, assessing him with a condescending air. Without even bothering to ask if he needed help, Ben gave him a dismissive nod and said, "Can I help you with something? Or are you just looking around?" There was a clear judgment in his voice, a suggestion that Kelvin's appearance disqualified him from being a serious customer. Kelvin's jaw clenched. He had seen this behavior before. People like Ben believed that wealth was determined by how one dressed or carried themselves. Kelvin was no stranger to this form of subtle racism, but it always stung. Despite the simmering anger inside him, Kelvin remained calm. "I'm just looking," he replied coolly. Ben, satisfied with the response, turned to walk away. "Let me know if you need anything," he called over his shoulder, his tone barely masking the indifference. Kelvin stood still, seething. He was not sure what was more enraging, the blatant disregard for him as a customer, or the fact that Ben had assumed his worth based solely on his appearance. As Kelvin exited the store, the weight of the experience hit him like a wave. He stood outside on the busy street, the noise of the city drowning out his thoughts. His hands were trembling, and his heart raced with a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could Ben, a man employed by him, treat anyone this way, especially in his own store? Kelvin took a moment to collect himself. It wasn't just about him, though. This wasn't the first time someone had been treated unfairly because of their race or appearance. The injustice stung, but it also fueled a new fire inside him. He had to do something about this. His brand, his empire, stood for more than just high-end fashion. It was about breaking barriers, about offering a place where everyone felt valued. But that message was being lost, and the person responsible was none other than Ben White. Kelvin felt the sharp bite of betrayal, but knew this was the test he needed. Tomorrow he would confront Ben, but this time he would do it as Kelvin Oxford, the owner. The following day, Kelvin entered the store again, this time dressed in his signature designer's suit. He walked confidently to the center of the store, his presence commanding attention. Ben, busy chatting with a customer, glanced over but didn't immediately recognize him. Kelvin approached the manager with deliberate steps, his eyes narrowed with purpose. "Ben White," he said, his voice firm yet measured. Ben turned, eyes scanning Kelvin before recognition slowly dawned. "Mr. Oxford," he stammered, clearly caught off guard. Kelvin allowed the silence to stretch, watching as Ben visibly shifted from relaxed to tense. "I was here yesterday, just another customer, and you treated me as if I were beneath you," Kelvin said coldly. Ben's face flushed with guilt, but he quickly masked it with a feigned smile. "Sir, I apologize if you felt that way. It wasn't my intention." Kelvin wasn't buying it. It wasn't just the cold treatment. It was the assumption that I didn't belong, that my presence here was an inconvenience. Ben remained silent, his eyes darting nervously. Kelvin continued, "You've been treating customers this way for a long time, haven't you? Judging them by their clothes, their appearance. It needs to stop." Ben opened his mouth to speak, but Kelvin cut him off. "You've tarnished the reputation of this store, and it's time for a change." Ben's shoulders slumped, his bravado slipping away as Kelvin's words sank in. Kelvin walked away from the confrontation, his heart still racing. He felt a strange mixture of relief and tension. Confronting Ben was only the first step, but Kelvin knew he had to address the larger issue, the culture of discrimination that had crept into his brand. He called a meeting with the company's executives that afternoon, making it clear that the actions of a single employee would no longer be tolerated. "This company was built on diversity," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I will not allow anyone, especially those in positions of power, to diminish the values we stand for. If there's anyone who doesn't believe in inclusivity, now is the time to leave." The room fell silent. His words hung in the air like a challenge. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him. He wasn't just the boss. He was also the one who had built this empire from the ground up. If he allowed one person's ignorance to destroy it, then everything he had worked for would be meaningless. The executives were quick to nod in agreement, but Kelvin could tell that some of them were nervous. He didn't care. He had made his point. Ben was fired that afternoon. Kelvin had made it clear that there was no room for such behavior in his company, regardless of the person's position. He met with Ben one-on-one, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I've given you plenty of chances," Kelvin said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "But your actions are not in line with what this company stands for. You're no longer needed here." Ben's face went pale, and for the first time, Kelvin saw fear in his eyes. Please, sir, I didn't mean to. But Kelvin cut him off. You did, Ben. You meant every word, every look, every insult. And now you'll face the consequences. As Ben walked out of the office, Kelvin couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Ben had been a problem, yes, but the issue was bigger than him. It was about the culture he had created within the company, the subtle and not so subtle racism that had taken root over the years. Kelvin felt both vindicated and exhausted. He knew he couldn't stop there. The work was just beginning. Kelvin called an emergency meeting with his store staff. He addressed them directly, the fire in his voice unmistakable. What happened here yesterday will not happen again. We are a family, and no one, no matter their race, their background, or their appearance, will ever be treated differently. You will respect every customer who walks through that door, or you will leave. His words were sharp, but necessary. As he spoke, he could see the unease on the faces of some of his employees. It wasn't just Ben who had fostered this toxic culture. It had permeated the store on a deeper level. Kelvin knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was committed to making it happen. He implemented new training programs focused on inclusivity, empathy, and customer service. He also began conducting surprise visits, ensuring that the staff maintained the high standards he had set. Slowly, but surely, Kelvin began to see the results. There were still challenges to overcome, but the atmosphere in the store began to shift. People smiled at one another, and customers were treated with respect, regardless of how they dressed. The store felt like a place where everyone truly belonged. The news of Ben's firing spread like wildfire. The media caught wind of the story, and soon Kelvin was being bombarded with questions. Headlines blared about the racial incident in his flagship store, and reporters wanted to know how the situation had escalated so quickly. Kelvin handled the onslaught with grace. He made a public statement, explaining his decision and emphasizing that inclusivity and respect were the foundation of his brand. This is not just about one employee, he said in an interview. It's about creating a space where everyone, regardless of who they are, feels valued. The response was mixed. Some praised him for taking a stand, while others criticized him for not addressing the issue sooner. But Kelvin wasn't concerned with public opinion. He knew that what he had done was right, and he was willing to weather the storm if it meant protecting the values he held dear. While many employees embraced the changes Kelvin had implemented, there were others who resisted. Some felt that the company's new direction was too much, too fast. They missed the old days when they could look down on customers and treat people based on their preconceived notions. Kelvin noticed the subtle signs of rebellion, whispers in the hallway, cold stares in meetings, but he refused to let it deter him. He continued to push for change, knowing that the long-term success of his company depended on it. But the resistance wasn't always easy to spot. It was often hidden behind the mask of politeness, behind the carefully constructed words that tried to maintain the status quo. Kelvin realized that he would have to be vigilant, constantly checking in with his employees and making sure they understood the importance of the new values. There could be no compromise. One afternoon, a young woman named Alice entered the store, looking for a dress for an upcoming event. She wasn't dressed in the usual high-end fashion. Instead, she wore a simple pair of jeans and a t-shirt. As she wandered through the racks, she caught the eye of one of the sales associates, a woman named Amanda. Amanda glanced at Alice's clothes, and for a moment, Kelvin thought he saw a flash of judgment in her eyes. He watched carefully, his heart pounding. He had to know if the changes had truly taken hold. Alice moved toward a particularly expensive dress, and Amanda, without hesitation, approached her. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her tone friendly and welcoming. Alice nodded and mentioned the event she was attending. Amanda immediately began pulling options from the racks, making suggestions and offering advice. Kelvin watched, his chest swelling with pride. Amanda had passed the test. She was treating Alice as if she were any other customer. No judgment, no assumptions. The change was real. Kelvin smiled to himself. This was only the beginning. With the changes in place and the company's reputation beginning to recover, Kelvin found himself facing new challenges. As his business grew, so did the pressure. There were new competitors entering the market, eager to steal away his loyal customers. But Kelvin wasn't worried. He had always prided himself on being adaptable. As the brand began to embrace its new inclusivity-driven approach, he noticed an uptick in sales, especially among diverse groups who felt seen and valued. But with growth came its own set of problems. Kelvin had to balance his personal values with the need to expand. He couldn't afford to lose sight of his core mission, even as the company reached new heights. He surrounded himself with like-minded individuals who shared his vision, ensuring that his brand would never stray from its commitment to inclusivity and equality. Kelvin stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city. His empire was strong again, but the work was far from over. He had to ensure that every new store, every new employee, every new customer understood what Oxford Enterprises stood for. The future of his company depended on it. He called a meeting with his team, explaining his vision for the next phase of growth. "We are more than just a fashion brand," he said, his voice resolute. "We are a movement, a testament to the power of inclusion, respect, and empowerment. As we expand, we must keep these values at the core of everything we do." The team nodded in agreement, ready to take on the challenge. Kelvin knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to fight for the future of his empire. It was no longer just about selling clothes. It was about changing the world.